Thank you for listening to Liberty Christian Center's podcast. Let's join Pastor Paul Carlson for today's message.
Bought back. Can you say bought back? And here's the deal is you and I have been bought back. Our lives have been purchased. We know the price has been paid. How many ways can I say this? The price has been paid for you and I to walk free right here on planet Earth. Some people have the idea, well, when I get to heaven, I'll be free. You know what the devil will do? He'll always paint your freedom in the next place. You know that? It's always, when I get to Wisconsin, then I'll be free. Well, we all know that. But, or when we get to heaven, then we'll be free. Let me tell you what. Jesus paid the price for you to be free right now, right here today. His blood speaks over your life. Wow, blood. Can you say blood in church? Yeah, blood. Jesus paid the price for us with His very own blood. Wow. And that blood, is just, it's still today. It's doing stuff in us. It's enforcing. It's our receipt in the Spirit for the covenant that we live in. Now, I've given some scriptures. I'm just going to read these to set the tone again, because this is how it came to me as I was studying. But in Hebrews 12, and I'm just going to go right to verse 2, it tells us this information. It tells us this, that when Jesus was looking at the cross, and He was seeing what He was going to have to go through for our redemption, it says that was because of the joy set before Him. Now, the cross wasn't the joy. The torment wasn't the joy. But what the joy was is you and I. You and I are that joy that Jesus saw, that He said, yes, for the joy set before me, I'll endure the cross. I'll endure the shame. I'll endure all the things that are associated with it because they're worth it. Can you say, I'm worth it? You may not think, that's a hard one for people to say. People don't want to say they're worth it. It's just bragging. I don't know. All these thoughts come into our head. You feel uncomfortable. But it's not about how you felt. It's what Jesus believed, what He saw. He says, you're worth it. You're worth it. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the Apostle Paul said some words, and just the way it came out here and it hit me, I want to read it again. It says, therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Now, what does that have to do with being bought back? Because when you know you're bought back, that's how you're going to live. That's how you're going to live. Steadfast, immovable, always abounding. I like that. There's always abounding in the work of the Lord. The Christian life, is such that it gets better and better and better the more you go. I love, just growing old in the Lord. Sometimes I look back and I can't believe how stupid I used to be. And I'll probably do the same thing 20 years from now. I'll look back and think, man, can you believe that back in the day? Oh, my goodness. But here's the thing. Do you guys have goals? Do you have a goal as a Christian? Like what your goal is as a Christian? What do I want to have as a Christian? I have a goal as a Christian too, I think, this year I'll have been saved 40 years. I mean, is that wild? That just blows me away. 40 years. That's longer than I was a sinner. Of course, I'm a new creature. Yeah, anyway. But I have goals as a Christian. You know what my goal is? You know what it's not? My goal is not to come in here on Sunday morning and have memorized all the words to the songs we're going to sing. I got it down now. I can really enter in. I know every word. I can shut my eyes and you shut your eyes. I don't care if you're singing the same words I am, but put your heart into it. Love God. Did we do that song in this last service? I don't know if we did. Yeah, Pastor Stephen got off in the spirit in the first service, and second service was great too. I don't want to make you jealous if you weren't here during the first service. I know a couple people here are double dippers, so we've been around. We know what's happening. But in the first service, Pastor Stephen got off on a song, and I had all the words down. It was like this. It went, ooh, wah, 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 ooh, ooh, ooh. And I thought, cool, I can just shut my eyes. I don't need to know nothing. I just, yeah, all right. It was so good. But that's not my great and lofty goal as a Christian, is just to know all the words to the songs. And, it's not even to memorize, the New Testament even. Okay, that's not my goal. I think it'd be really cool if I had done that, or if I could do that, or if it happened. But that's not my goal as a Christian. It's just to memorize scriptures. It's not even my goal to become some deep theologian. In fact, it's kind of my goal not to be that, okay? Sorry, if you're a theologian, we love you, and God loves you too, and it's cool. But my goal as a Christian is just simply this, is just to know Him better. To know Him better. I remember when I first got born again, God, I wouldn't know what to tell you, but my eyes wide open like a deer looking at a headlight, I guess, but I'd say, wow, God's real. He talks to me. And if you're not careful, if you hang around the church too long, they'll talk you out of that stuff. Oh, man. Oh, don't be careful about your experiences. I mean, I don't know if that's really legit. Let me tell you what, man, God's legit. And He can show up in your life. He can be real to you. He's more real to me when it's just me and Him than it is even when we're here at church. And everybody's here. But I love being at church and in the presence of God here. But do you know what I'm saying? I mean, it gets amplified because I have this time with Him, when it's just Him and me, and Dana's sleeping or something, But I'm talking to God. I'm telling Him about life. I'm telling Him about what I'm really thinking about, on the inside, and asking Him, what do I do? And He's speaking back to me and showing me things. That's Christianity, folks. That's what life's like, getting to know Him better every day. Paul said it like this, and I still didn't look up the scripture, but I think it's in one of them Corinthian chapters, Is that close enough? Something like that. You don't need to put it up. But here's the verse. It says this, that now I can't even tell you the verse. Glory to glory. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, Paul talked about the Christian life, and he said it's like from going from glory to glory to glory. And then he said these words. He said, even by the Spirit of the Lord. So, the Christian life is just not getting comfortable and hanging out on a cloud somewhere and saying, yes, I have arrived. Quite the opposite. The Christian life is about this thing in you that's, Smith Wigglesworth said it like this. And I remember when I first heard this or read this, and I thought, that just doesn't sound right. You ever do that? I remember one time I was sitting in Bible school, and do you guys know who T.L. Osborne is? Some of you do. T.L. Osborne's in heaven now, but when T.L. Osborne was alive, he preached face to face, with probably more people than anybody in his day. He had crusades where they would have, and this was way back, in the, decades ago. They had crusades where they didn't have things like jumbotrons and stuff where they could broadcast. He had crusades where they'd have 500,000 people would come out. And this is what T.L. would do. He'd stand up there and say, if you don't see miracles, if you don't see the blind getting their vision, the cripple walking, he says, then I just challenge you to just stone me right here. Now, I didn't say that today. Don't, ushers. He would do that. He'd go into these countries like Africa and, and just, he'd challenge the witch doctors first night. And you know what you saw? You saw the blind seeing, deaf hearing, cripples. I heard one time they took a cripple guy and because we used to watch his movies in school. They took a cripple guy, they threw him on the stage, and he hit the stage and he got healed right on the spot. He had so many people there that he wouldn't lay hands on them. He'd just pray massive prayers, and then he'd have people get up and testify. All right, so anyway, telling you who T.L. Osborne is. His son-in-law used to teach the class I was sitting in at Bible school. And he had been T.L.'s crusade director for, 20 years or something. And he said this, that T.L. Osborne had a philosophy. He said he never really trusted someone fully until he'd gone through the fire with them. And, when you're only about 2 years old in the Lord, you know so much. I knew everything. I knew everything back then. It was amazing. I could correct sermons and everything, and tell them, you're wrong, you're preaching heresy. I knew it all. And he said that, and I went, that doesn't sound very Christ-like. You should trust him right now, and anyway. Well, as years have gone by, I've realized that, it's not that you don't trust people, but it's like when you have gone through things with people, when you've lived life with people and experienced things with people and got to the other side with people, there is something there that's pretty unshakable. Man, oh man. So you know what? Be open to learn. But I read Smith Wigglesworth say, he's never, I can't even quote him, but he said something to this effect. He says, I've learned in life to only be satisfied with unsatisfaction of where I am. That's my English accent, in case you couldn't tell. That's English plumber accent, okay? Smith was a plumber, and until he started preaching. But I thought, man, that just doesn't sound good to me, doesn't it, But now I kind of get it. He wasn't saying you can't be content in life. Pastor Stephen taught on being content a couple weeks ago. And he wasn't saying you don't be content with who you are, where you are, and what God's doing in you. But he was saying this. He says, I always have a thirst. I always have a hunger. I always have an expectancy for things to change, for things to get better. And Paul said it like this. He says, man, I'm continually being changed from glory to glory to glory, even by the Spirit of the Lord. I've said this to Dana for years, just, talking about us and our marriage and our life. I've said, hang on, baby, because the best years are yet to come, I tell, and the reason I even tell her that is because God said that to me. He told me that. He said the best years are yet to come. And when he told me that, I thought, well, I've had some pretty good years. That's what I thought. This was in the time when we had kids. Love my kids. But I was, not sleeping great at night. And Dana and I had each other before that. And all of a sudden I was getting pulled every which way. I felt like, you know how it is when you feel like that? And God says, hey, your best years are ahead. Man, you know what? He's still telling me that. He's still telling me that. And as a Christian, it gets better. It gets better. So what's my goal? That's all I was telling you. My goal is to know him better. To know him more. I don't want to get hooked into, a bunch of fact-finding and mental games or whatever. Man, he invades every part of our lives. Our mental things, our spiritual things, our everything. He's just all there. And, his voice gets more real to you when you just become familiar with him, when you talk with him. You talk with him long enough, you get to know and recognize his voice. And he'll tell you stuff. Sometimes Dana and I will be watching like shows that are like, how would I say it? There's like you could guess the outcome. There's questions, here's one. We'll be watching like the show called Pawn Stars. Did you hear how I said that? Pawn, P-A-W-N stars, Chumley and the guys, you know them? And they'll always put up trivia things there. And sometimes I'll just be sitting there. I'll say, it's B. And she'll say, do you know that? And I'll say, no, I don't know that. But it'll end up being B. It's because God told me that. Sometimes I'm out to lunch, but she can tell. She can tell when I say it because I say it with such authority. I say, it's B. And then she'll ask me if I know it. And nope. And when I tell her I don't know it, then she knows I'm right. Get to know him better. Get to know him more and more. That's what our covenant is all about. Our covenant isn't about just, having a bunch of rules and regs. Our covenant isn't just about, legalities, okay? It is legal, but it's not about that. It's a legal entrance into His presence so we can get to know Him. You know, our covenant isn't about just studying this thing so we can memorize it and quote it in 5 translations and blah, blah, blah. That's really cool. But if you can do that, I'm hoping that along with that, there's a vital connection. And that you can actually say, man, I know God. He spoke to me. You know, He speaks in 5 versions. No, He speaks in your language. He speaks to you and He shows you things that matter in your life. Okay? All right. Got a couple minutes left. So we're talking about being bought back. And this week I was kind of looking at some Old Testament stories, you know, and I'm pretty much a New Testament kind of guy, New Testament preacher, but I tell you this, the Bible's all about testament. It's all about covenant. And it's divided into 2 parts, you know, basically there's an Old Covenant and there's a New Covenant. You know, the Old Covenant is Genesis to Malachi, and the New Covenant, you know, you'll find it, you know, it really kicks in Acts and stuff, but Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then on through into the end of Revelation. You know, so I'd say this, that it's good to go back and look at the Old Covenant, but do it knowing this, that I'm a New Testament, I'm a New Covenant person looking at the Old Covenant. Know where you live. Know where you live. You're living in the New Covenant. And when you look at Old Testament, Old Covenant things, see them from the perspective of where you are today. Okay? All right. So I was looking at some Old Covenant stories, you know, about some people that had God break through in their life. And the thing I notice is this, is that the Bible is full of stories about people, and they're just people like you and me. You know, you can read these things sometimes and you get the idea that there's some kind of superhuman people or you know, or here's one. Even in the realm of the Spirit, you'll go, well, they are a prophet. They're a prophet. Of course these things happen. They're a prophet. A prophet. Did you hear me? A prophet. The truth is, you're just as redeemed as any prophet. The truth is, the new covenant, that Jesus' blood was shed for you just as much as any prophet. In fact, Jesus said, you know, of all the prophets, He said, John the Baptist was the greatest. But He said that all those in the new covenant, are even greater. Because you've been made new. Because you've got God living in you. Because He's real. He's a reality. What I'm really talking about today is living your life like He is real. Looking, maybe that's the key word, is looking at your life as though your covenant was real. Looking at your situation. Is anybody in a situation right now? I mean, at any given moment, we're all in some kind of situation. But your situations cannot define you if you'll see them through the perspective that God is right there in the middle of them. Okay? So anyway, the first one I was looking at was over in Numbers 13. And probably in this service I'll do the same thing as I did in the first one. I'm going to tell you the story as opposed to read it. But where I'm going from is Numbers 13, you know, right around in verse 25 is where I started. And here's the deal. The children of Israel have been taken out of Egypt, okay? They'd been in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt for, I think it was 400 some years. And God had promised a deliverer. And of course, we know this, that Moses ended up being that person that God worked through and brought deliverance to His people. So what did deliverance look like? Well, they marched free from the Egyptians. And, you know, they walked out of Egypt and they're on their way to the promised land. And you guys know the story? You following me? I mean, when they left Egypt, it says that they had gold heaped on them, and they left there, and everybody was healthy. There was no sick among them, and they were on their way to the promised land. And what I'll tell you is this, you need to know this, that God isn't just there in the promised land, but God is there in your journey to the promised land. Okay? And if you fail to see that God is there in your journey, you're going to have a hard time getting into the promised land. Okay? Again, it's always in that next phase. And the next, if I get there, man, I tell you, it's going to be so good. No, it's good right now. It's good right now. God is real right now. He's real in your journey. So, all right. Here's God be real right now when I try to go through this material in limited time. Okay? Yeah, thank you, Lord. All right, so they get up to the brink of the promised land, and they decide they're going to send in 12 spies to search out the land and see what's before them. And, that could make some battle sense, I'm sure. But the guys go in, and they come back with a report. And 10 of the guys that went, 10 of the 12 come back with this report. And they begin by telling everybody how great this place is. It is just as God had said. Man, I tell you, there's they describe it as milk and honey. They talked about the grapes. They're so big and they're so huge. But then there came a point in Numbers 13 and verse 28, there were something drastic changes, and there's a word they throw in here, and this word isn't necessarily bad, but in this particular context, it turned out to be really bad. In chapter 13, verse 28, they said this word. It's called nevertheless. Nevertheless. Now, Peter used that word a few times, talking about Peter's experiences, but in Peter's case, he factored God into it, and it became a good thing. But when these 10 spies used this word nevertheless, they talked about how great this promised land was, but the nevertheless they slipped in there was to say, man, I tell you, the price is too high, the boundary is too big, I can't get through what's standing between me and that place. Nevertheless, there's giants in this place. Nevertheless, they're huge. I'm telling you what, they're the cousins of Anak or somebody that came to live there, and they're going to stand between us and what God has for us. Has the devil ever told you that there's people standing in between you and what God wants you to do and what God wants you to have? Does he ever tell you that kind of stuff? I'm telling you what, there's nothing standing between you and what God has for you except our own thinking, our own perspectives. Now, 2 other spies that went out there, I know you guys know this story, but man, I was just looking at it, and what I'm seeing in it is just the perspective that you got to have for life, okay? These 10 spies, they went in there. These 10 spies had been through the miracles that happened in Egypt prior to the release of the children of Israel. They'd seen God move in a mighty way, and they'd seen God's hand upon them day after day. They got manna, and they had their provisions were made. They saw water come out of a rock. I haven't seen that. That'd be cool. I like that. But somehow their perspective got clouded with impossibilities, and they factored God totally out of their whole life. And so those 10 did that, but 2 others, Joshua and Caleb, these guys had been through the same circumstances. They're sitting in the same position, right on the edge of the promise, with all these giants and barriers between them and what God wants for them. And what they saw is, listen, it doesn't matter what's before me. God is with me. God is for me. Who could be against me? I'm going up. It doesn't matter who the giant is or who his cousin is or where he came from. God is for me. I'm in covenant with the Most High God. And of all the people there, of all the children of Israel there that day, the only 2 that went in and really took hold of the promises that God had for them were Joshua and Caleb. 40 years passed from the time, that they had this first expedition. And when it got back to it and they stood in the same place 40 years later, Caleb came up to Joshua, who was the acting leader of this group. And Caleb said to Joshua, he said, hey, we're right there. Remember, we were here before once. We can do this. And Joshua, he says, look over there. He says, see that mountain over there? He says, that's mine. I'm taking that mountain. He says, and the Bible's so clear, it says he was 80 years old, but he had the strength like a young man. He says, I can take that mountain. And you know what? He went out and he took it. It doesn't matter how old you are. That can be a barrier in people's mind. They think, oh, I'm too old. I can't do this kind of stuff. I'm telling you what, God is living in you. You know, David, I think it was David said this. He says, he'll make you, run through a troop and leap over a wall. I only half understand what that even means, but I know this. It means you get energized. Got some spring in you. You got a Tigger kind of jumping around on the inside of you. Ooh, yeah. Ooh, baby, yeah. All right, one more story of somebody that had covenant vision. And this is a young guy. I read about him this week, and he didn't seem to be the leader of the pack. He was just a young guy, kind of a runt, and his name was David. And what happened is David had some older brothers, and they had some wild names. They didn't have cool names like David. They were pretty cool. I'm sure they were cool in the day. I'm sure they had a little thing on their shirt said Eliab and what was the other one here? In any case, they're Abinadab or something. Anyway, but David was the young guy. The three of the older brothers went off to war with Israel. They were going to, stand against the Philistines. They got to a place, the three older brothers, with the armies of Israel, where the Philistines were on one side of a valley and they were on another. And the Philistines, they get this champion in their ranks. His name is Goliath. And Goliath is almost 10 feet tall. That's a tall guy. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen anybody 10 feet tall. I've seen a guy 8 feet something, 8'2", I think, once was at a show once I saw, and it was pretty impressive. He had a ring on his finger. This guy that was 8 foot tall, 8'2", and he could take his ring off and pass a silver dollar through the ring, and so it was pretty big. Goliath was even bigger, 10 foot, almost 10 foot, 9 foot something, and Goliath was the obstacle, because what happened is they made this deal. They said, "Listen, here's our champion. Give us your champion. Whoever wins gets it all." Well, that sounds good until you look at Goliath, and he's a giant. He's bigger than anybody you ever saw. His spear, I can't even lift his spear. It's so big. And not only that, but he comes out day after day after day. The guy is relentless. He comes out, and it says, in one version, it says this: he breathes threatenings. Now, what does that even mean? He breathes threatenings. It means that's just who he is. It's what comes out of him. He's going around intimidating people. They probably got it. Well, look at that. His spear was like a fence rail. Tip alone weighed 15 pounds, and the shield bearer walked ahead of him. I mean, how do you even throw such a thing? Anyway, Goliath. But he breathes threatenings day after day to the armies of Israel. And somehow it says this, that they all heard these words that Goliath would say day after day. And of course the thing is this, is giants in your life will talk to you. Giants in your life are relentless to breathe threatenings against you. They're relentless to tell you why you'll never have what God says you're supposed to have. All right, so back on the farm, David's there, and he's tending the sheep. And what I've found out reading this story is that David was there tending the sheep, and really his heart was to be somewhere else. He really wanted to be with his brothers fighting giants and doing all this kind of stuff. But he, because of his position, had to be back there tending the sheep. And what I see in it is this, is don't ever take for granted the time you're in right now. Okay? Because while David was tending the sheep, God was grooming him and preparing him for what lied ahead. Okay? It's really hard when you're there tending the sheep to realize that God is actively moving in your life. You tend to think you're wasting time I've been there. I've thought that. And then I've had the advantage of to live on and look back and see that the very time I thought I was wasting, God was doing things in me. Showing me things that were going to be important in the days ahead. So David's there, and he's learning things. He may not even, who wants to sit in school? Some people do. Anyway, let's not go there. Anyway, but David had his heart. He wanted to be somewhere. But the thing is that we know this too, is David, in his time tending sheep, was getting to know God. What do you mean? Well, have you ever read the Psalms? David wrote many of the Psalms. And he said things like, I heard your voice. I sought you in the night, and there you were, and you spoke to me. David was hearing God. David's relationship with God was being solidified. And what does that do to you? That makes you a champion. That makes you more than a conqueror, as Paul says it in the New Testament. And so David's there, watching the sheep, and God is showing up and being real to him. Now, I think it's pretty epic. It's pretty epic that a lion and a bear came and tried to take the sheep. But really, the lion and the bear were just preparatory for David, for him standing before Goliath. But where you're at, in the preparatory times, God can be real to you, and God will begin to show you how to use His power on your behalf. Now, when David did go before Saul, I skipped ahead. All right, so David's out there tending sheep, and Jesse is his dad. And Jesse comes up to David and says, hey, David, I got an assignment for you. He says, I'm going to have you leave the sheep for a little bit. And he says, I've got some cheese sandwiches, and I want you to bring them to your brothers who are there on the battlefield. So he packed up a big picnic basket, and David goes, all right, here it is. I get some action. And he goes there, and he brings his cheese sandwiches to his brothers, and he drops them off. But while he's there, what do you think he hears? He hears the very same thing that the other soldiers from Israel had been hearing day after day. Those threatening words that gripped them with fear, that held them, captive. They heard the giant speak. David heard the giant speak, but you see, David knew where to filter those words. He knew they couldn't rob his perspective of life. They knew this. He knew this, that those words were not going to come and steal the vision he had of who God was and who he was in God. Okay? You see, just because you're a champion for God doesn't mean you don't hear the words of the devil come at you. Okay? Goliaths are going to speak. Mountains are going to speak. Giants are going to speak. They're going to tell you can't do it, but I'm telling you what, you've got to have a connection with God that's so real that you say, yes, I can. I'm standing up. And David had that. He went before the king. He says, listen, some of the words he said to the king were so important. This is what he said to Saul. He said this. He said, who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Now you say, well, goodness, he's getting all medical on me now. Yeah, no, that wasn't it at all. He says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? All David was saying is this, in simple terms. He was saying, this guy does not have a covenant with the Most High God. We do. Doesn't matter how big he is, God's on our side. What was he doing? He was seeing his life. He was seeing his condition through covenant perspective. Okay? All right. Seeing the enemy through the eyes of the covenant. You could say this. He was looking cross-eyed at the world. Okay? All right. Think about that. Anyway. Whoa, 2 o'clock this afternoon, they'll go, oh my God. What do I want to tell you? All right, so giants will speak to everybody. You need to choose the message you're going to meditate on. Meditate on God. Let Him be bigger. I find this, it comes back to me all the time, is the key to living in victory is magnify God in everything you do. Magnify God. Make Him bigger than the problems you're facing. Make Him, the biggest thing in your life. Spend enough time with Him that He's real to you. You'll see the power of your covenant displayed. Now we know this, that even when David went to face Goliath, that Goliath, he was still breathing threatenings, telling him all kinds of things, telling him he's a dog, that he's going to feed him to the birds, and all these kinds of things. But David stood up and said this. He says, "Today the battle's the Lord's." He took his sling and he threw that rock at the giant. It hit his forehead. I like to say nothing like that had ever entered his mind before, and David actually, he went up with his sword and cut Goliath's head off. God will empower you to put an end to giants that are facing you in your life. And the thing that I saw too is this, that really this whole episode with Goliath, God was continuing to groom David because there were more battles ahead. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but there's more battles ahead. But the good end of that is this: Jesus is Lord. And He's faithful in every one. In the battles you're fighting today, man, He's teaching you how to stand strong in the ones that come tomorrow. Don't minimize where you're at today, but maximize who God is in your life right now.
Thank you for listening to Liberty Christian Center's podcast. To partner with this ministry or for any additional information, please visit libertychristiancenter.org.